The axe bit deep into the oak, sending splinters flying across the clearing like tiny wooden daggers. Silas Boone pulled it free and swung again, his muscles burning with the familiar ache that had become his only companion these past 8 years. Each strike echoed through the mountain silence, the only sound for miles except for his ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. 8 years. 8 long, brutal years since he'd spoken to another human being for more than the few grunts it took to buy supplies in town. 8 years since he'd touched a woman's hand or heard a woman's laugh. 8 years since the good people of Pine Ridge had branded him a monster and driven him up into these mountains like a rabid dog. The memories crashed over him like they did every morning when the sun crested the peaks. The Hendricks family crying as the landowners came to take their farm. Little Jenny Hendricks, barely 12, clinging to her mother's skirts as men with papers and badges demanded they leave the only home they'd ever known. The corrupt officials who'd changed the land records, stealing from families who couldn't read well enough to fight back. And Silas, 25 and full of righteous fury, had tried to stop them. He'd fought like a man possessed that day, taking on 6 men to protect the Hendricks family. Blood had been spilled, plenty of it. 2 men ended up in the doctor's office with broken bones. 1 lost 3 teeth. The sheriff, who was in the landowner's pocket, had called it an unprovoked attack by a dangerous man who couldn't control his temper. The townspeople believed what they were told. Who would trust the word of a poor mountain man against respectable businessmen? Within a week, mothers were pulling their children to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Women clutched their purses tighter. Men reached for whatever weapon they carried. Silas Boone's got the devil in him, they whispered. Beat those men half to death for no reason. He's not right in the head. Dangerous as a cornered bear. So he'd given them what they wanted. He'd become the beast they said he was, retreating to his grandfather's old cabin high in the mountains where he could hurt no one and no one could hurt him. The axe handle slipped in his sweaty grip and he cursed, throwing it aside. His reflection caught in the small window of his cabin. Wild hair past his shoulders, a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months, eyes that had forgotten how to hold another person's gaze. He looked exactly like the monster they'd made him out to be. His stomach growled, reminding him that his supplies were running low again. The beans were gone, the coffee nearly finished, and he was down to his last few strips of dried meat. He'd have to go into town again, endure the stares and whispers, hand over his money to people who wished he'd disappear forever. Maybe this time he wouldn't come back. Maybe he'd just keep walking until he found someplace where nobody knew his name or his story. Start over somewhere else if a man like him could ever truly start over. He pulled on his cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, and hitched his horse to the small wagon. The ride down the mountain took 2 hours, winding through forest paths that few people knew existed. As the trees thinned and the first buildings of Pine Ridge came into view, his chest tightened with the familiar dread. The town looked the same as always. White-painted houses with neat gardens, a main street lined with shops, the tall spire of St. Catherine's Church pointing toward heaven like an accusing finger. People moved about their business, shopping, talking, living the normal lives he'd forgotten how to live. He was tying his horse to the post outside Brennan's General Store when the church bells began to ring. Not the usual call to Sunday service, it was only Wednesday, but the special pattern used for weddings. Through the store window he could see old Brennan watching him with suspicious eyes, but Silas ignored him. He had bigger concerns than one shopkeeper's fear. As he loaded supplies into his wagon, more bells joined the first. The whole town seemed to be celebrating something. Groups of people were walking toward the church, dressed in their finest clothes, chattering excitedly. A wedding then. Some lucky couple starting their life together while he loaded beans and coffee into a wagon, preparing for another season of solitude. He was about to climb onto the wagon seat when he heard something that made his blood run cold. "It's a shame about the Wynn girl," one woman was saying to another as they passed by. "Forced to marry that awful grim man to pay her father's gambling debts. She's barely 22 and he's old enough to be her grandfather. The wedding auction system is barbaric," the other woman replied. "But what choice does she have? Her father owes Grimm more money than they'll see in a lifetime." Silas's hands tightened on the wagon's side. A forced marriage. A young woman being sold to pay debts that weren't hers. The same corruption that had driven him from town was still poisoning everything it touched. He told himself it wasn't his business. He tried to help people before and look where it had gotten him. The smart thing was to climb into his wagon and head back to his mountain, back to his safe, lonely existence where he couldn't make things worse for anyone. But his feet were already carrying him toward the church, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the memory of little Jenny Hendricks and how helpless she'd looked. Maybe it was 8 years of isolation finally driving him completely mad. Or maybe it was just the desperate need to do something, anything, that might redeem one small piece of his wasted life. The church doors stood open, and he could hear the preacher's voice echoing inside. If any man has objections to this union, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Silas reached the doorway and stopped. Inside he could see a young woman in a white dress standing at the altar next to a man 3 times her age. Even from behind, he could tell she was beautiful, graceful neck, dark skin that glowed in the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows, hair arranged in elegant curls beneath a simple veil. But it was the way she held herself that broke something inside his chest. Shoulders straight but trembling slightly. Head held high despite the circumstances. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the defeat in every line of her body. The preacher continued, "Theodore Grimm, do you take this woman?" "Stop." The word tore from Silas's throat before he could think about what he was doing. Every head in the church turned toward him, and the collective gasp that went up could have blown out every candle in the building. He stepped inside, his boots echoing loudly on the wooden floor. The woman at the altar had turned too, and now he could see her face. She was even more beautiful than he'd imagined, with large dark eyes that held both fear and hope. She was looking at him like he might be her salvation or her destruction, and she wasn't sure which would be worse. "I haven't seen a woman in 8 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent church. The words felt strange on his tongue, like a confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. Clara Wynn's hands trembled as she clutched the small bouquet of wildflowers someone had thrust into her palms just minutes before. The white dress she wore had belonged to her mother, altered hastily to fit her smaller frame, and it smelled faintly of the lavender sachets that had protected it in the trunk for 20 years. She dreamed of wearing it someday, but never like this. Never with her heart pounding in terror and her future being sold to the highest bidder. The sanctuary of St. Catherine's Church was packed with people, but Clara felt utterly alone. Their faces blurred together as she fought back tears. Neighbors who'd known her since childhood, friends who'd played with her in these very church halls, all of them watching her sacrifice herself on the altar of her father's sins. 3 days ago, she'd been planning to start her new job as a teacher at the elementary school. She'd spent weeks preparing lessons, arranging her small classroom, dreaming of helping children learn to read the way her mother had taught her. Then Theodore Grimm had appeared at their door with a stack of gambling debts bearing her father's signature and a proposal that made her stomach turn. "Your father owes me $8,000, he'd said, his pale eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Money he lost at my poker table over the past 2 years. I'm willing to forgive the debt in exchange for your hand in marriage." Her father, Patrick Wynne, hadn't even had the courage to look her in the eye. He'd sat in his chair by the fireplace, head hanging in shame, while Grimm laid out the terms. The wedding auction was a legal practice in their county. Families in desperate circumstances could arrange marriages to settle debts, with the church overseeing the process to ensure it was honorable. Honorable. Clara almost laughed at the bitter irony. There was nothing honorable about a 22-year-old woman being forced to marry a 60-year-old man who owned half the businesses in town and had buried 2 wives already. "You have 3 days to decide," Grimm had told her, tipping his hat like a gentleman. "But understand, Miss Wynne, that this is the most generous offer you'll receive. Few men would be willing to take on such a substantial debt for a woman with no dowry and questionable family connections." Questionable family connections. He meant her father's drinking and gambling, the whispered rumors about her mother's death, the way their family had slowly fallen from respectability into poverty. Clara had spent her whole life trying to rise above those whispers, working twice as hard as everyone else to prove her worth. But none of that mattered now. She'd considered running away, of course. But where could she go with no money and no family to take her in? Her father would still owe the debt, and Grimm had made it clear he would take their small house and everything else they owned. At least this way her father would have a roof over his head. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Clara Elizabeth Wynne and Theodore Benjamin Grimm." The words felt like stones in her chest. She tried to focus on something else. The stained glass window depicting Jesus with his arms outstretched, the smell of beeswax candles, the soft rustle of Mrs. Henderson's silk dress in the front pew. Anything but the man standing beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and hear his labored breathing. Theodore Grimm was not a kind man. Everyone in town knew it, though few dared say so openly. He foreclosed on families who missed payments by even a day. He charged outrageous rents for his properties and evicted tenants with no notice. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, a fall down the stairs that left her with a broken neck. His second wife had simply disappeared one winter night, though Grimm claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman. Clara knew she was likely signing her own death warrant by marrying him. But what choice did she have? Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, the preacher continued, but with careful consideration and mutual respect. Mutual respect. Clara bit her lip to keep from making a sound that might have been laughter or a sob. The only thing Grimm respected was money and power, and she had neither. She glanced around the church one more time, hoping against hope that someone would object, that some miracle would save her from this fate. But the faces looking back at her were full of pity, not rescue. These people had their own problems, their own debts to Grimm, their own reasons to stay quiet and let this travesty proceed. Her gaze landed on Mrs. Patterson, her former teacher, who had tears streaming down her cheeks. On young Tommy Henderson, who'd once asked permission to court her and now couldn't meet her eyes. On her father's sister, Aunt Ruth, who'd refused to even attend the ceremony because she couldn't bear to watch. The couple has chosen to write their own vows, the preacher announced. Mr. Grimm, you may speak first. Grimm cleared his throat and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. His vows, Clara realized with growing horror, were probably about as romantic as a business contract. Clara, he began, his voice carrying easily through the church, you are a beautiful young woman who will bring honor to my household. I promise to provide for you as my wife, to give you a comfortable home and position in society. In return, I expect your loyalty, obedience, and dedication to making our marriage a success. Loyalty, obedience, dedication. Not love, not partnership, not even basic kindness. Just the expectation that she would be a decorative object in his house, grateful for the privilege of warming his bed and bearing his children. Clara, the preacher prompted gently, your vows? She hadn't written any. What was there to say? That she promised to endure whatever he did to her? That she would try not to die too quickly so he'd get his money's worth? That she hoped he would at least be quick about killing her when he grew tired of her? She began, then stopped. The words wouldn't come. How could she promise to love and honor a man she despised? How could she lie before God and all these people? Take your time, dear, the preacher said kindly, though she could see the concern in his eyes. He knew this was wrong too, but like everyone else he was powerless to stop it. Clara opened her mouth to force out whatever words would end this nightmare when a voice from the back of the church cut through the silence like a blade. Stop. Every head turned toward the sound, and Clara felt her heart skip as she saw the man standing in the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with long dark hair and a beard that hadn't seen a barber in months. His clothes were simple work clothes, clean but rough, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. They were the deepest blue she'd ever seen, and they held a pain that matched her own. He looked like a man who'd been through hell and somehow found his way back, only to discover that the world had moved on without him. I haven't seen a woman in 8 years, he said, and his voice was rough with disuse and emotion. The church erupted in whispers. Clara heard Grimm suck in an angry breath beside her, heard the preacher clear his throat nervously, heard someone in the back pew mutter, "That's Silas Boone. The mountain man. What's he doing here?" Silas Boone. She'd heard the name whispered in frightened tones since she was a child. The dangerous man who lived alone in the mountains, who'd beaten several men nearly to death and been driven from town for his violence. Parents used his name to scare children into behaving. Be good or Silas Boone will come down from the mountain and get you. But looking at him now, Clara didn't see a monster. She saw a man who looked as desperate and trapped as she felt, who'd walked into this church for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. He started walking down the aisle toward them, and Clara could feel the entire congregation holding its breath. The church felt smaller with each step Silas took down the aisle. Every eye was on him, and he could hear the whispers starting up like a storm wind through dry leaves. That's him. The beast. What's he doing here? Someone should call the sheriff. He ignored them all. His attention was fixed on the young woman at the altar, the one whose dark eyes were watching him with a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Not just her face, though that was lovely enough, but the courage he could see in the set of her shoulders, the way she stood tall despite everything trying to break her down. This was Clara Wynne, he realized. He'd known her father years ago, back when Patrick was just a man who enjoyed cards and whiskey a little too much, before the gambling had consumed him completely. Clara had been just a girl then, maybe 14, helping her mother tend their small garden and dreaming of becoming a teacher like the woman who'd inspired her. Now she was being sold like cattle to pay for her father's weakness. "Sir," the preacher said nervously as Silas reached the front of the church, "this is a private ceremony. If you have business here, perhaps we could." "I have business," Silas cut him off, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "This woman is about to make the biggest mistake of her life, and I aim to stop it." Theodore Grimm stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "You have no right to interrupt this ceremony, Boone. Clara is my bride, legally contracted, and I'll thank you too." "She's not your anything yet," Silas said, turning his attention to the banker. Up close, Grimm looked even worse than from a distance, soft and pale, with small, calculating eyes and hands that had never done an honest day's work. The preacher asked if anyone had objections. "I'm objecting." "On what grounds?" Grimm demanded. "You can't just walk in here and—" "On the grounds that she doesn't want to marry you," Silas said simply. He looked at Clara, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Do you want to marry this man?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara's mouth opened, then closed. The honest answer was written all over her face, but saying it out loud would change everything. She began, then looked around the church at all the watching faces. Her father sat in the front pew, head down, unable to meet her eyes. The congregation waited breathlessly for her response. "The debt," she whispered. "My father's debt. If I don't marry Mr. Grimm, he'll lose everything." "How much?" Silas asked. $8,000, Grimm answered before Clara could speak. "A substantial sum that took 2 years to accumulate. I'm being more than generous by accepting marriage as payment." Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. He'd been saving money for 8 years, living off the land, selling furs and handmade goods to traders who didn't ask questions. $8,000 was almost everything he had, but what good was money to a man who lived alone on a mountain? "I'll pay the debt," he said, tossing the pouch at Grimm's feet. "Every cent right now." The church erupted. People gasped and began talking all at once. Grimm's face went from red to purple as he stared at the pouch. "You can't be serious," the banker sputtered. "This is highly irregular. The marriage contract has already been signed. There are legal obligations." "The marriage hasn't happened yet," Silas pointed out. "Until she says, 'I do,' she's a free woman. And I'm making her a better offer." He turned to Clara, who was looking at him like he'd just grown wings and begun flying around the church. "Miss Wynne, I'm asking you to marry me instead." The silence that followed was so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Clara stared at him, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're being forced into something you don't want. I know you deserve better than to be sold like property to pay another man's debts. And I know that if you marry me, you'll be free to make your own choices." "But I would still be married," she pointed out. "Still bound to a man I don't know." Silas nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. "Yes, but I'm not Theodore Grimm. I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do. I won't hurt you or use you or treat you like a possession. You'd have your own room, your own space, your own life. And if you ever decide you want to leave, I won't stop you." Clara looked between him and Grimm, weighing her options. Marriage to a man who would probably kill her within a year, or marriage to a man who was offering her freedom. It wasn't really a choice at all. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. 8 years ago I tried to help a family who was being cheated by corrupt men. I failed and they lost everything anyway. Maybe this is my chance to get it right." He extended his hand to her. "What do you say, Miss Wynne? Will you marry me?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then at Grimm's furious face, then at her father who was finally looking up at her with something that might have been hope. She thought about the teaching job she'd dreamed of, the life she'd wanted to build, the freedom she'd never had. This mountain man was offering her a chance at something better. Maybe not love, not yet, but respect and kindness and the possibility of finding her own path. It was more than anyone else had ever offered her. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was calloused from years of hard work, but his grip was gentle, careful not to hurt her. "Yes," she said loud enough for the whole church to hear. "I'll marry you." The church exploded into chaos. People were standing up, talking over each other, some shouting objections while others seemed thrilled by the unexpected drama. Grimm was demanding his money back, threatening lawsuits, insisting the original contract was still binding. But Silas wasn't listening to any of it. He was looking at Clara, at the way her face had transformed when she'd made her choice. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else now, determination, maybe even excitement. "Preacher," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion, "I believe you have a wedding to perform." The preacher looked around helplessly, clearly out of his depth. This is most irregular. I'm not sure the law." "The law says she can choose her husband," Silas interrupted. "She's chosen. Now marry us." Clara squeezed his hand and he squeezed back. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Before anyone could object further, Silas leaned down and kissed her. It was meant to be just a brief touch, something to seal their agreement and make it clear to everyone watching that she was no longer available to Theodore Grimm. But the moment their lips met, something electric passed between them. Clara's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned into him slightly, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a promise. Of protection, of partnership, of possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. When they broke apart, Clara was looking at him with wonder in her eyes. "Marry us," Silas told the preacher again, his voice rough with emotion. "Now." The wagon ride away from St. Catherine's Church felt like escaping from a dream, or maybe entering one. Clara sat beside Silas on the hard wooden seat, her white wedding dress spread around her like foam on water, trying to process what had just happened. An hour ago she'd been preparing to marry Theodore Grimm. Now she was Mrs. Silas Boone, heading up a mountain road with a man she'd met 30 minutes before their wedding ceremony. The hastily performed marriage had been a blur of confused protests and legal technicalities. Grimm had threatened lawsuits and demanded the return of his money, but the preacher had pointed out that Clara was legally free to choose her husband until the moment she said, "I do," to someone else. Since she'd clearly chosen Silas, the original contract was void. Her father had wept when Silas handed over the money to pay his debts. Not tears of joy, Clara noticed, but tears of shame. He knew what he'd almost cost her, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry, Clara," he'd whispered as she hugged him goodbye. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through." "It's over now, Papa," she told him, though she wasn't sure it really was. One nightmare might be ending, but another could be just beginning. Now, as the wagon climbed higher into the mountains, Clara stole glances at her new husband. He handled the reins with easy confidence, guiding his horse along paths that seemed barely wide enough for the wagon wheels. His profile was strong and weathered, like a man who'd spent years facing harsh elements. But there was something gentle in the way he held the reins, careful not to jerk the horse's mouth even when navigating difficult turns. "Are you cold?" he asked, noticing her shiver as the mountain air grew thinner. "A little," she admitted. The wedding dress wasn't designed for mountain travel, and the late afternoon was giving way to evening. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat and handed it to her. It was warm from his body heat and smelled like pine trees and honest work. Clara wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Thank you for everything. What you did back there. I know you didn't have to." Silas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. 8 years ago, I watched a family get destroyed because I couldn't stop the men who were cheating them. The Hendricks family, they lost their farm, their home, everything. Little Jenny Hendricks was about your age when they got thrown off their land." He paused, his hands tightening on the reins. "I swore I'd never watch that happen again if I could prevent it." "Is that why everyone calls you dangerous?" Clara asked carefully. "Because you fought those men?" Silas let out a bitter laugh. "I broke some bones and bloodied some noses trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The sheriff was in the landowner's pockets, so they made me out to be the villain. Said I was a violent man who couldn't control his temper." Clara studied his profile, looking for signs of the monster the townspeople described. All she saw was a man carrying a heavy burden of guilt and loneliness. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Fighting for them?" "No," he said immediately. "I regret that it didn't help. I regret that they suffered anyway. But I don't regret trying to do what was right." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as they climbed higher. The forest grew thicker around them, towering pines and oaks that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Clara should have been frightened, heading into the wilderness with a man she didn't know, but somehow she felt safer than she had in weeks. "Tell me about your home," she said eventually. "What should I expect?" Silas seemed to consider this carefully. "It's not much," he said finally. "My grandfather built the cabin back in the 1840s when he first came west. It's solid and warm, but it's not fancy. No electricity, no indoor plumbing. Water comes from a well, heat from the fireplace and wood stove. It sounds peaceful, Clara said and meant it. After years of living under her father's shame and the town's judgment, the idea of a simple life in the mountains held unexpected appeal. It is peaceful, Silas agreed. Sometimes too peaceful. 8 years is a long time to live with only your own thoughts for company. Clara heard the loneliness in his voice and felt something stir in her chest. This man had sacrificed his place in society to help others, then punished himself with isolation for failing to save them. There was something noble in that, even if it was also tragic. "Why didn't you ever leave?" she asked. "Go somewhere else, start over where nobody knew your story?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, guiding the wagon around a particularly sharp curve. "I thought about it," he said finally. "Planned it even. But this mountain is the only home I've ever known. My grandfather's buried up here and my parents. Leaving felt like abandoning them too." Clara nodded, understanding that kind of attachment to place even when it brought pain. She'd dreamed of leaving Pine Ridge herself, but something had always held her back. "What about you?" Silas asked. "What were your plans before today?" "I was going to be a teacher," Clara said, and couldn't keep the wistfulness out of her voice. "I had a job lined up at the elementary school. I was going to help children learn to read and write, maybe inspire a few of them the way my teacher inspired me." "What's stopping you from still doing that?" Clara looked at him in surprise. "I'm married now. Married women don't typically work outside the home." "Says who?" Silas asked. "I told you, you're free to make your own choices. If you want to teach, teach. The mountain children could use a good teacher. Most of them don't get much schooling." The possibility hadn't even occurred to Clara. In her experience, marriage meant the end of a woman's independence, the beginning of a life devoted entirely to her husband's needs and wishes. But Silas was offering her something different. Partnership instead of ownership. "You'd really let me do that?" she asked. "It's not about letting you do anything," Silas said firmly. "It's about respecting what you want for your life. I married you to give you freedom, not to take it away." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. When was the last time someone had cared about what she wanted? The path was getting steeper now, and she could see a clearing ahead through the trees. As they came around the final bend, Silas's cabin came into view and Clara caught her breath. It wasn't grand, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Built of logs that had weathered to a soft gray, with a stone chimney sending a thin curl of smoke into the evening air. A small porch faced west, positioned to catch the last rays of sunlight. Gardens and outbuildings were arranged around the main structure, everything neat and well-maintained. "It's lovely," Clara said and meant it. Silas seemed pleased by her reaction. "It's home," he said simply. As he helped her down from the wagon, Clara realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was about to enter a home where she was wanted, where she was welcome, where she didn't have to apologize for existing. It felt like the beginning of something she'd never dared to hope for. Clara woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was different, softer than her narrow cot at her father's house, and sunlight was streaming through windows that faced the wrong direction. Then memory flooded back. The wedding, the mountain, the gentle man who'd given her his own bedroom while he slept on the parlor sofa. She'd protested when Silas had shown her to his room the night before, insisting she could sleep anywhere, but he'd been firm about it. "A lady deserves a proper bed," he'd said, gathering blankets and a pillow for himself. "I've slept on worse than that sofa, believe me." Now, dressed in the simple blue dress she'd packed in her small bag, Clara made her way to the kitchen. Silas was nowhere to be seen, but he'd left fresh coffee on the stove and a plate of biscuits on the table, still warm from the oven. A note written in careful script lay beside them. "Gone to check the traps. Back by noon. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home." The word stirred something unexpected in Clara's chest. When had anyone ever said that to her and meant it? She poured herself coffee and took it out to the porch, settling into one of the 2 wooden chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. The view was breathtaking. Rolling mountains stretched as far as she could see, covered in forest that showed the first hints of autumn color. A small stream bubbled somewhere nearby, and birds called to each other from the pine branches. The peace of it was almost overwhelming. No shouting neighbors, no church bells marking time she couldn't control, no whispers following her down the street. Just silence and beauty and the freedom to sit quietly with her own thoughts. She was still there an hour later when Silas emerged from the forest, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her as if surprised to find her there, then smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Good morning," he said, climbing the porch steps. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted. "Thank you for the coffee and biscuits. They were delicious." Silas looked pleased. "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me to cook when I was barely tall enough to reach the stove." He gestured to the rabbits. "I thought we might have stew tonight if that suits you." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said. "Can I help?" "You don't need to." "I want to," she interrupted. "I'm not used to sitting idle and I'd like to learn my way around your kitchen." "Our kitchen," she corrected herself, still getting used to the idea. Silas nodded, understanding. "I'd appreciate the company. It's been a long time since I had someone to cook with." They spent the morning working together in the kitchen, Silas showing Clara where everything was kept while they prepared the rabbits and vegetables for stew. His hands were gentle as he demonstrated how to joint the meat, patient when she asked questions about seasoning and cooking times. "You're a good teacher," Clara observed as she watched him work. "Had to learn everything the hard way after my folks died," Silas said. "Figured if I ever had the chance to pass it on, I'd try to make it easier for someone else." There was no self-pity in his voice, just matter-of-fact acceptance of the life he'd lived. Clara found herself wanting to know more about this man who'd rescued her, who seemed to carry his burdens without complaint. "How old were you when they died?" she asked gently. 16, Silas said, washing his hands in the basin. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. My grandfather had passed the winter before, so it was just me after that." "I'm sorry," Clara said, meaning it. "That must have been terribly lonely." Silas shrugged. "I had the mountain. The animals. It was enough most of the time." But Clara heard what he didn't say, that sometimes it hadn't been enough, that a 16-year-old boy grieving his parents had needed more than wilderness and solitude could provide. They worked in comfortable quiet for a while, and Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. There was something soothing about the simple domestic tasks, the easy rhythm they fell into together. When Silas reached around her to get a pot from the shelf, she didn't flinch the way she would have with any other man. When their hands touched as he handed her a wooden spoon, she felt warmth instead of fear. "Clara," Silas said as they sat down to a simple lunch of bread and cheese, "I want you to know that you can ask me anything. About the mountain, about how we'll live here, about what I expect from this marriage." Clara set down her bread, hearing the serious note in his voice. "What do you expect?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I expect nothing," he said finally. "I hope for friendship, maybe eventually companionship. But I won't pressure you for anything more than you're willing to give." "And if I'm never willing to give more?" Clara asked, testing the boundaries of his promise. "Then that's your choice to make," Silas said without hesitation. "I meant what I said yesterday, you're free to live your life as you see fit." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden expectations. She found only sincerity and something that looked like understanding. "Why?" she asked. "Most men would expect marital rights." Silas's jaw tightened slightly. "Most men didn't watch their new wife get forced to the altar to pay another man's debts. You've been through enough, Clara. The last thing you need is a husband who sees you as property he's entitled to use." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Clara had spent so many years bracing herself against men who wanted to take from her. Her father taking her earnings to feed his gambling habit, Grim wanting to take her body and her freedom, even well-meaning suitors who saw her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. But Silas was offering her something she'd never experienced, respect without strings attached. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. "How to be married to someone who doesn't want to control me." "We'll figure it out together," Silas said. "There's no hurry, no pressure. We have all the time in the world." After lunch, Silas offered to show her around the property. They walked the boundaries of his land, nearly 200 acres of mountain forest and meadow that his grandfather had claimed decades ago. He showed her the garden where he grew vegetables, the pen where he kept chickens, the workshop where he crafted furniture and tools to trade in town. "You built all this yourself?" Clara asked, admiring the solid construction of the various outbuildings. "Most of it," Silas said. "Had help with the barn raising from some of the other mountain families back before." He trailed off, but Clara understood. Back before the town branded him a dangerous man and even his neighbors began to fear him. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Having neighbors, being part of a community?" Silas considered this. "Sometimes. But people show their true colors when times get hard. Most of the folks who turned their backs on me weren't really friends to begin with. Clara nodded, understanding that betrayal. She'd experienced her own version when her father's gambling debts became public knowledge and former friends had suddenly become too busy to visit. They ended their tour at a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the cabin. 3 wooden crosses marked the graves of Silas's family, weathered but well-maintained. Fresh wildflowers lay on each grave. "I come up here most evenings," Silas said quietly. "Tell them about my day, ask their advice when I'm struggling with something." "What did you tell them about me?" Clara asked. Silas smiled slightly. "That I finally did something right. That maybe they can stop worrying about me being alone up here." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty of it. This man had carried his grief and guilt in solitude for 8 years, talking to stones because he had no one else to talk to. "They must be proud of you," she said, "for saving me yesterday." "I hope so," Silas said. "I hope they understand why I brought a stranger into their home." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Clara said impulsively, then blushed at her boldness. But Silas smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. "No," he agreed. "You're not." As they walked back to the cabin in the golden light of late afternoon, Clara felt something shifting inside her chest. The fear that had dominated her life for so long was beginning to give way to something else. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could be herself without apology. For the first time in years, Clara was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 weeks into their marriage, Clara had settled into a rhythm of life on the mountain that felt more natural than anything she'd ever experienced. She woke each morning to the sound of Silas chopping wood or tending to the animals, dressed quickly, and joined him for breakfast before they began their daily tasks together. She'd taken over most of the cooking, discovering that she had a talent for creating hearty, flavorful meals from simple ingredients. Silas had shown her his stores of preserved vegetables, dried herbs, and cured meats, and she'd begun experimenting with combinations that brought genuine pleasure to his weathered face. In return, he was teaching her the skills she'd need to thrive in the mountains. How to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. How to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. How to preserve food for the winter months ahead. Each lesson was given with patience and encouragement, as if her learning brought him as much joy as it brought her. But it was the evenings Clara treasured most. After supper, they would sit by the fire while she mended clothes or worked on the sampler she was embroidering for the cabin walls. Silas would whittle or repair tools and they would talk, really talk, in a way Clara had never experienced with anyone. He told her about his childhood on the mountain, the wisdom his grandfather had shared, the way his parents had loved each other with a quiet devotion that had made their simple cabin feel like a palace. She shared her own memories, her mother's gentle teachings, her dreams of education and independence, the growing fear she'd lived with as her father's gambling had spiraled out of control. But there were still shadows between them, parts of Silas's story that he hadn't shared. Clara could see it in the way his jaw tightened when certain topics came up, the way his eyes grew distant when he thought she wasn't looking. She didn't push, she understood about painful secrets, but she hoped that someday he would trust her enough to share the whole truth. That day came sooner than she expected. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. She'd learned to recognize the sound of Silas's horse, and this wasn't it. Multiple horses, moving fast, their hoofbeats urgent on the mountain path. She dropped the sheet she was hanging and hurried around to the front of the cabin, where Silas was emerging from the workshop with a hammer still in his hand. His face had gone tense at the sound of the approaching riders. "Go inside," he told her quietly. "Lock the door and don't come out unless I call for you." "Silas, what?" "Please, Clara. Just do as I ask." The urgency in his voice sent Clara hurrying into the cabin. She locked the door as instructed but couldn't resist peering through the window to see what was happening. 3 men on horseback were approaching the cabin. Clara recognized one of them immediately, Sheriff Morrison, a thin, nervous man who'd always seemed more concerned with keeping the peace than seeking justice. The other 2 were strangers, but their expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as men of importance. "Silas Boone," Sheriff Morrison called out as the riders came to a stop in front of the cabin. "We need to talk." "Sheriff," Silas replied evenly, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "What brings you up the mountain?" One of the other men dismounted, a tall fellow with silver hair and cold eyes. "I'm Judge Hamilton from the county seat. We're here about the Hendricks matter." Clara's breath caught. The Hendricks family, the ones Silas had tried to help 8 years ago, the ones whose suffering had driven him into exile on this mountain. That matter was settled years ago, Silas said carefully. Actually, it wasn't, Judge Hamilton replied, pulling a leather folder from his saddlebag. New evidence has come to light. Evidence that changes everything. The third man dismounted as well, and Clara saw that he was younger than the others, with ink-stained fingers that marked him as a clerk or lawyer. He was carrying a heavy satchel that he set carefully on the ground. Mr. Boone, the young man said, my name is Attorney Warren. I've been investigating land fraud cases throughout the county, and I believe you were wrongfully accused in the Hendricks matter. Silas went very still. Wrongfully accused of what? Of being the aggressor, Judge Hamilton said. Of attacking innocent businessmen without provocation. He took the folder from Attorney Warren and opened it. We've uncovered evidence that you were acting in defense of the Hendricks family against a conspiracy to steal their land. Clara pressed closer to the window, her heart racing. This was what Silas had been carrying all these years. Not just the pain of failing to help the Hendricks family, but the injustice of being branded the villain when he'd been trying to be the hero. Samuel Hendricks contacted us 3 months ago, Attorney Warren continued. He's been living in California, working to rebuild his life after losing the farm. But he never forgot what you did for his family, and he never stopped looking for a way to clear your name. Sam's alive? Silas asked, and Clara could hear the emotion in his voice. Alive and prosperous, Judge Hamilton confirmed. He owns a successful ranch now, and he's been using his resources to investigate what happened to his family's land. What he found would shock you. Sheriff Morrison dismounted as well, looking uncomfortable. Silas, I owe you an apology. We all do. The men you fought that day, they weren't legitimate businessmen. They were part of a land-grabbing scheme that stretched across 3 counties. Attorney Warren opened his satchel and began pulling out documents. Forged deeds, bribed officials, intimidated witnesses. It was all part of an organized effort to steal land from families who couldn't fight back legally. You stumbled into the middle of it when you tried to help the Hendricks family. The men you fought, Judge Hamilton added, were enforcers hired to terrorize families into signing over their property. You didn't attack innocent people, Mr. Boone. You fought criminals who were in the process of committing a crime. Silas sank onto the porch steps, the hammer falling from his nerveless fingers. 8 years, he said quietly. 8 years I've been living with the guilt of failing to save them. You didn't fail, Sheriff Morrison said earnestly. The Hendricks family got away safely because of what you did. Yes, they lost their land, but they kept their lives. Without your intervention, they might not have survived. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Silas process this revelation. The man she'd married wasn't just a good man who'd been wrongly accused. He was a hero who'd been living in exile for doing the right thing. There's more, Attorney Warren said gently. The original charges against you have been dropped. Your name has been cleared officially. And there's the matter of compensation. Compensation? Silas looked up, confused. Judge Hamilton smiled for the first time since arriving. The land fraud conspiracy was extensive, Mr. Boone. When we recovered the stolen assets, there was a substantial fund set aside for victims and those who suffered as a result of the crimes. Your 8 years of unjust exile qualify you for a significant settlement. He handed Silas a bank draft, and even from her position at the window, Clara could see Silas's eyes widen as he read the amount. I don't want money, Silas said, trying to hand it back. I just want my name cleared. It's already cleared, Sheriff Morrison assured him. This money is yours by right. Use it however you see fit. Attorney Warren gathered up his papers. Mr. Boone, you're free to return to town whenever you choose. Your reputation has been restored, and anyone who still believes the old lies will be corrected. After the men had remounted and ridden away, Silas sat on the porch steps for a long time, staring at the bank draft in his hands. Clara finally unlocked the door and went to sit beside him. You heard all that? He asked without looking up. Every word, Clara confirmed. Silas, I'm so sorry you've carried this burden alone for so long. He was quiet for a moment, then turned to look at her. Do you know what this means? Clara thought she understood, and her heart clenched with sudden fear. It means you can go back to town. Live a normal life again. No, Silas said, reaching for her hand. It means we can go back to town if we want to. It means you can have that teaching job you dreamed of. It means we can build whatever life we choose together. Together? Clara asked, hardly daring to hope. Together, Silas confirmed, squeezing her hand. If you'll have me. Not as a desperate woman with no other choice, but as a woman who's free to choose her own path. Clara looked into his blue eyes and saw not just kindness and respect, but love, real, deep, abiding love that had grown quietly between them over these past weeks. "I choose you," she said simply. "I choose this life we're building together." When Silas kissed her this time, it wasn't the desperate kiss of their wedding day or the gentle kiss of new acquaintances. It was the kiss of two people who'd found their home in each other, who'd chosen love over fear and hope over despair. And for the first time in 8 years, Silas Boone was truly free. Clara was teaching her first mountain school class when Theodore Grimm arrived to destroy her happiness. She'd converted the old community hall at the base of Silas's mountain into a schoolhouse, and 8 children from the scattered mountain families were bent over their slates, carefully copying the letters she'd drawn on the makeshift blackboard. "Remember, children," she was saying, walking between the rough wooden desks Silas had built for them, "the letter A starts with a line that goes up and to the right, then another line that goes up and to the left, and then a line across the middle to connect them." Little Beth Morrison, the sheriff's 7-year-old daughter, raised her hand. "Mrs. Boone, why do some letters look different when they're small?" Clara smiled, delighting in the child's curiosity. "That's an excellent question, Beth. We call the big letters capitals and the small letters." She paused as she heard horses approaching outside. Not unusual in itself, parents often came to check on their children's progress, but something about the sound made her uneasy. Through the window she could see 3 horses approaching. The lead rider was unmistakably Theodore Grimm, his expensive black suit and silver-topped cane marking him even at a distance. Behind him rode 2 men Clara didn't recognize, but their hard faces and the guns at their hips suggested they weren't there for friendly conversation. "Children," Clara said, keeping her voice calm despite the fear rising in her chest, "I want you to continue practicing your letters. I need to step outside for a moment." She walked to the door on unsteady legs, her mind racing. What could Grimm possibly want? Their marriage had been legally dissolved when she married Silas. The debt had been paid in full. There was no legal connection between them anymore. But as Grimm dismounted and approached the schoolhouse, the predatory smile on his face told Clara that legality might not be his primary concern. "Mrs. Boone," he said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Or should I say Mrs. Grimm? After all, our original marriage contract still stands." "Our contract was voided when I married Mr. Boone," Clara replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "The preacher made that very clear." Grimm's smile widened. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. You see, I've done some research into mountain law and I've discovered some very interesting precedents." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Clara unfolded it with trembling fingers, trying to make sense of the legal language inside. "What this says," Grimm continued as she read, "is that marriage contracts for debt settlement cannot be voided by subsequent marriages unless all parties agree to the nullification. Since I never agreed to release you from our contract, your marriage to the mountain man is invalid." Clara's blood turned to ice. "That's not possible. The preacher married us legally." "The preacher married you under false pretenses," Grimm interrupted. "You were already contractually bound to me. Your mountain man may have paid your father's debt, but that doesn't change the fact that you were my intended bride first." One of the men behind Grimm shifted in his saddle, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. The message was clear. Clara could come willingly or be taken by force, but she was coming either way. "Even if what you're saying is true," Clara said desperately, "I won't go with you. I'm a married woman." "You're my woman," Grimm snarled, his genteel mask slipping. "You were promised to me to settle a debt, and I intend to collect what's mine. I've waited long enough." Through the schoolhouse window, Clara could see the children watching with wide, frightened eyes. She couldn't let them see violence, couldn't let them be traumatized by whatever Grimm planned to do. "The children," she said quietly. "Let me dismiss the children first." Grimm glanced at the window and seemed to remember where they were. 5 minutes, he said. "Send them home, gather your things, and then we leave." Clara nodded and went back inside, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to get word to Silas. He was up at the cabin nearly an hour's ride away. Even if one of the children could reach him, would he arrive in time? "Children," she said, forcing herself to smile, "we're going to end class early today. I want you all to pack up your slates and papers and head straight home. Tell your parents that school will resume tomorrow." "But Mrs. Boone," Beth Morrison protested, "we haven't finished our letters yet." "We'll finish them tomorrow," Clara promised, though she had no idea if she'd be alive tomorrow, let alone free to teach. "Now hurry along, all of you." As the children gathered their belongings, Clara caught young Tommy Patterson's arm. Tommy was 12, the oldest of her students, and his family's farm was closest to Silas's mountain. "Tommy," she whispered urgently, "I need you to ride as fast as you can to Mr. Boone's cabin. Tell him that Mr. Grimm is here with legal papers, claiming I'm still bound to marry him. Tell him to bring help." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding. He'd heard the adults talking about Mrs. Boone's dramatic wedding day, and he knew who Theodore Grimm was. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered back. "I'll ride like the devil himself is chasing me." "Be careful," Clara warned. "Stay off the main path so they don't see you." Tommy nodded and slipped out the back door while the other children filed out the front. Clara watched through the window as he ran to where he'd tied his pony, then mounted and rode off through the trees, taking the hidden trails that only the mountain children knew. Now she just had to buy time and hope that help would come before Grimm lost patience. "Time's up," Grimm called from outside. "Come along, my dear. We have a wedding to finish." Clara stepped outside, her chin raised despite her fear. "I'm not going anywhere with you willingly. If you want to take me, you'll have to do it by force in broad daylight where everyone can see what kind of man you really are." Grimm's face darkened. "I was hoping we could do this the civilized way, but if you insist on being difficult." He nodded to his companions, who dismounted and began walking toward Clara. "You're making a mistake," Clara said, backing toward the schoolhouse door. "My husband will come looking for me." "Your husband," Grimm sneered, "is a has-been mountain man with a violent reputation. When you disappear, people will assume he finally lost control and did something terrible to you. Who's going to believe his story over mine?" The truth of it hit Clara like a physical blow. Despite his recent exoneration, there were still people in town who believed Silas was dangerous. If she disappeared, he'd be the obvious suspect. "Besides," Grimm continued, "by the time anyone realizes you're missing, we'll be long gone. I have a preacher waiting in the next county who's willing to perform our ceremony immediately. Once we're properly married, there won't be anything your mountain man can do about it." The two hired men were almost close enough to grab her now. Clara looked around desperately, hoping to see Tommy returning with help, but the mountainside was empty except for the three men who'd come to destroy her life. "Don't fight us, Mrs. Grimm," one of the men said, reaching for her arm. "This'll go easier if you cooperate." Clara jerked away from his grasp. "My name is Mrs. Boone, and I'm not going anywhere with you." "Enough," Grimm snapped. "Take her. We've wasted enough time on this charade." The man lunged for Clara again, and this time his partner moved to block her escape route. Clara realized with growing terror that her delaying tactics had failed. Tommy was still riding for help, but help was too far away. She was on her own, and Theodore Grimm was about to take her away from everything she'd learned to love. The sound of approaching horses made Clara's heart leap with desperate hope, but when she looked up the mountain path, her heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Silas riding to her rescue, it was Tommy Patterson's father, Mike, along with Sheriff Morrison and three other mountain men, all armed and looking grimmer than death itself. But no Silas. "Theodore Grimm," Sheriff Morrison called out as the riders surrounded the schoolhouse, "you're trespassing on private property and threatening a married woman. I suggest you mount up and ride out before this gets ugly." Grimm's confidence never wavered. "Sheriff, I'm here on legal business. This woman is bound to me by marriage contract, and I'm simply claiming what's mine." He held up the document he'd shown Clara earlier. "Everything's perfectly legal, I assure you." Sheriff Morrison took the paper and read it carefully, his frown deepening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Clara with troubled eyes. "Clara, I'm sorry, but this appears to be legitimate. If you were already contracted to marry Grimm before you married Silas, then your second marriage might not be legal." "That's impossible," Mike Patterson protested. "We all saw her choose Silas at the church. She was a free woman making her own decision." "Actually," Grimm said smoothly, "she wasn't free. She was already bound by this contract, signed by her father and witnessed by three upstanding citizens. The debt payment was simply a convenience, it didn't nullify the original agreement." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Could it be true? Could her marriage to Silas, the happiness she'd found, the life they'd built together, could it all be built on a legal fiction? "Even if that's true," Sheriff Morrison said reluctantly, "you can't just take her by force. There are proper legal channels." "Which take time I don't have," Grimm interrupted. "Every day she remains with that mountain man makes it harder to undo the damage to her reputation. I'm being merciful by handling this quietly." "Merciful?" Clara found her voice at last. "You call threatening me with armed men merciful?" "I call it practical," Grimm replied coldly. You can come with me now as my willing bride, or you can come with me as my reluctant wife after I've had the sheriff arrest your mountain man for kidnapping and fraud. Which would you prefer? The threat was clear and Clara felt trapped between two impossible choices. If she went with Grimm, she might save Silas from false arrest, but she'd be condemning herself to a life of abuse and likely death. If she refused, Grimm would use his influence to destroy Silas the way he'd destroyed so many others. I need time to think, she said desperately. This is all happening so fast. Time is a luxury we don't have, Grimm said. He nodded to his men who began moving toward Clara again. I'm sorry you're choosing to make this difficult. The lady said she needs time to think. The voice came from the forest behind the schoolhouse, and Clara's heart soared as Silas stepped into the clearing. He wasn't alone. Behind him came Attorney Warren, the young lawyer who'd brought news of his exoneration, along with Judge Hamilton and two other official-looking men Clara didn't recognize. Boone, Grimm snarled, his composure finally cracking. You're too late. She's coming with me and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Actually, Judge Hamilton said, stepping forward with a thick folder in his hands, there's quite a lot we can do to stop it. Mr. Grimm, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. Grimm's face went white. What are you talking about? I have legal documents. Forged documents, Attorney Warren corrected, opening his own folder. Documents created by the same criminal network that was stealing land throughout the county. The same network you were part of, Mr. Grimm. Clara watched in amazement as the two official-looking men moved to flank Grimm, their badges now visible on their coats. Federal marshals, she realized. Theodore Grimm, one of the marshals announced, you're under arrest for mail fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and operating an illegal gambling enterprise. You have the right to remain silent. This is outrageous. Grimm protested as the marshals moved to restrain him. I'm a respected businessman. You can't. We can and we are, Judge Hamilton said firmly. Mr. Grimm, your poker games weren't just crooked. They were designed specifically to create unpayable debts that you could then use to acquire property and other assets. We have testimony from 6 different victims, including Patrick Wynn. Clara gasped. My father testified against him? Your father felt terrible about what he'd put you through, Silas said gently, moving to her side. When the investigators contacted him, he told them everything. How Grimm had plied him with drink and then manipulated the card games to create massive debts. How the marriage contract was presented as the only way to avoid debtor's prison. The marriage contract itself is fraudulent, Attorney Warren added. It was created under duress and involves illegal gambling debts. Even if everything else were legitimate, which it isn't, the contract would be void under territorial law. As the marshals led Grimm away, still protesting his innocence, Clara felt her legs give out. The terror and stress of the past hour hit her all at once, and she sank onto the schoolhouse steps. Silas was beside her in an instant, his strong arms pulling her close. It's over, he whispered into her hair. He can't hurt you anymore. How did you know to bring them? Clara asked, looking up at Judge Hamilton and Attorney Warren. We've been tracking Grimm's activities for weeks, the judge explained. When young Tommy Patterson arrived at your cabin saying Grimm was here with legal papers, Silas knew immediately what was happening. We've been expecting Grimm to make a move ever since word got out about your marriage. You were expecting this? Clara asked. Attorney Warren nodded. Men like Grimm don't give up easily when they think they own something. We had evidence of his criminal activities, but we needed him to act openly so we could arrest him without questions about jurisdiction. You used me as bait, Clara realized. We protected you as bait, Silas corrected firmly. I would never have let him take you, Clara. Never. Looking into his eyes, Clara saw the truth of it. Silas would have fought an army to keep her safe, legal consequences be damned. What happens now? She asked. Now, Judge Hamilton said with satisfaction, Mr. Grimm faces federal charges that will likely put him in prison for the rest of his life. His assets will be seized to compensate his victims, including your father. And your marriage to Mr. Boone is completely legal and binding. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. Clara, I owe you an apology. When Grimm showed me those papers, I should have been more skeptical. I should have known a man like him couldn't have legitimate business here. You were doing your job, Clara said graciously. You couldn't have known the documents were false. As the officials departed and the mountain men dispersed to spread the news to their families, Clara and Silas found themselves alone outside the schoolhouse. The afternoon sun was slanting through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where her new life had nearly been destroyed. "Are you all right?" Silas asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I am now," Clara said, and meant it. "Silas, when I saw Grimm and his men, when I thought I might lose everything we've built together, I realized something." "What's that?" "I love you," Clara said simply. "Not just as the man who saved me, not just as my husband in name, but as the partner I want to spend my life with. As the man who makes me feel safe and valued and free to be myself." Silas's eyes filled with emotion. "Clara, I've loved you since the day you took my hand in that church and chose to trust me. Every morning I wake up grateful that you're here, that you chose this life with me." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "When Tommy came racing up the mountain saying Grimm was trying to take you away, I felt like my world was ending. I can't lose you, Clara. You're not just my wife, you're my heart." When he kissed her this time, it was with all the love and fear and relief of the day. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her own emotions into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara smiled through her tears. "Take me home, Silas," she said. "Take me home to our mountain." The courthouse in Pine Ridge had never seen such a crowd. News of Theodore Grimm's arrest had spread through the county like wildfire, and it seemed like half the territory had come to witness his trial. Clara sat in the front row next to Silas, her hand clasped tightly in his as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of testimony and investigation. Federal marshals had descended on Grimm's properties, uncovering evidence of fraud and corruption that stretched back nearly a decade. The gambling operation had been just one part of a larger scheme to acquire land and property through manufactured debts and forged documents. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Hamilton presiding. Judge Hamilton took his seat behind the bench, his expression grave as he surveyed the packed courtroom. "This court is now in session. We are here today for the sentencing of Theodore Benjamin Grimm, who has been found guilty on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping." Clara felt Silas squeeze her hand as Grimm was led to the defendant's table in shackles. The man who had terrorized her just 2 weeks ago looked diminished now, his expensive clothes replaced with plain prison garb, his arrogant confidence replaced with the hollow stare of a defeated man. "Before I pass sentence," Judge Hamilton continued, "I want to address the scope of Mr. Grimm's crimes and their impact on this community." He picked up a thick folder from his desk. "The evidence shows that over the past 8 years, Mr. Grimm orchestrated a criminal enterprise designed to defraud honest families of their land and property. He used rigged gambling games to create impossible debts, then offered marriage contracts or property transfers as the only way to settle those debts." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Everyone had suspected Grimm was crooked, but few had realized the extent of his crimes. "The Hendricks family," Judge Hamilton continued, "lost their farm not because of legitimate business dealings, but because Mr. Grimm and his associates forged documents and bribed officials to steal their land. When Mr. Silas Boone tried to protect them, he was framed as the aggressor to cover up the real crime." Clara saw several people in the courtroom turn to look at Silas, their expressions ranging from shame to admiration. For 8 years, they had believed the worst about a man who had been trying to protect his neighbors. Patrick Wynne, the judge continued, was systematically cheated at rigged card games until his debts reached impossible levels. Mr. Grimm then attempted to force Mr. Wynne's daughter into marriage as payment, not out of any genuine affection, but as part of his pattern of acquiring property and assets through fraudulent means. Clara's father, sitting 3 rows behind her, made a sound that might have been a sob. He had testified earlier in the week, his voice breaking as he described how Grimm had manipulated him, how the shame of his gambling had nearly cost him his daughter. "The evidence shows," Judge Hamilton said, "that Mr. Grimm has been responsible for the displacement of at least 12 families, the theft of over $50,000 in property and assets, and the systematic corruption of local officials who were supposed to protect the very people he was victimizing." Attorney Warren stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution has prepared victim impact statements from 14 individuals and families who were harmed by Mr. Grimm's actions. With the court's permission, I would like to read a few of these statements." "Proceed," Judge Hamilton nodded. Warren opened a folder and began to read. "From Samuel Hendricks, now residing in California. Theodore Grimm destroyed my family's legacy and drove us from our home with lies and forgery. But worse than the material loss was watching good people turn against Silas Boone, a man who risked everything to help us. For 8 years, I have carried the guilt of knowing that an innocent man was suffering because he tried to do right by my family. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as she thought about the years Silas had spent in isolation, believing he had failed the people he tried to help. Warren continued reading. From Martha Stevens, widow. Grimm foreclosed on my home after my husband died, claiming unpaid debts that I later learned were fabricated. I lost everything and had to move in with my sister's family. I thought my husband had hidden gambling debts from me, and I spent 2 years hating his memory before I learned the truth. The statements continued, each one revealing another layer of Grimm's cruelty. Families destroyed, reputations ruined, lives shattered, all for the sake of one man's greed and hunger for power. When Warren finished reading, Judge Hamilton turned his attention to Grimm. Mr. Grimm, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Grimm rose unsteadily to his feet, his lawyer beside him. For a moment, Clara thought he might offer some kind of apology or expression of remorse. Instead, his face twisted with the same arrogance and contempt she remembered from their encounters. I did what any businessman would do, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. I saw opportunities and I took them. If people were foolish enough to gamble away their property, that's their own fault. If they couldn't read the contracts they signed, that's not my problem. A gasp went up from the courtroom. Even his own lawyer looked stunned by the callous response. I provided services that people wanted, Grimm continued, apparently oblivious to the impact of his words. Gambling, entertainment, opportunities to settle debts. The fact that some people made poor choices is hardly my responsibility. Judge Hamilton's face had gone stone cold. Mr. Grimm, your response shows a complete lack of remorse and a fundamental failure to understand the gravity of your crimes. You have destroyed families, corrupted officials, and poisoned the trust that holds communities together. He picked up his gavel. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Additionally, all of your assets are to be seized and distributed as restitution to your victims. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Grimm's knees buckled, and his lawyer had to catch his arm to keep him from falling. Furthermore, Judge Hamilton continued, this court is issuing permanent restraining orders protecting all victims and their families from any contact with Mr. Grimm or his associates. Any violation of these orders will result in additional criminal charges. As the marshals led Grimm away, he turned back toward the courtroom, his eyes searching until they found Clara. The look he gave her was pure hatred, a promise that even prison bars wouldn't end his desire for revenge. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She was surrounded by people who cared about her. Silas, her father, the mountain families who had become her community, the students who looked up to her. Grimm's power had been broken, his secrets exposed, his victims freed from his influence. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to congratulate Silas and Clara. People who had shunned Silas for 8 years now approached with shame-faced apologies and genuine warmth. Silas, said Mrs. Henderson, whose son had been one of Clara's first students, I owe you a debt I can never repay. We all do. You were trying to protect us and we turned our backs on you. It's in the past, Silas said graciously, though Clara could see the emotion in his eyes. What matters is that the truth came out eventually. Sheriff Morrison approached with his hat in his hands. Silas, I want you to know that the county is prepared to offer you the position of deputy sheriff, if you're interested. We could use a man of your integrity in law enforcement. Clara felt Silas's surprise in the way his hand tightened on hers. After years of being treated as a dangerous outcast, he was being offered a position of trust and authority. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, Silas said carefully. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course, Morrison replied. Take all the time you need. As they walked back toward their wagon, Clara's father approached them hesitantly. Patrick Wynne looked older than his years, worn down by guilt and shame, but there was something lighter in his expression than Clara had seen in months. Clara, he said quietly, can you ever forgive me for what I put you through? Clara studied her father's face, seeing genuine remorse for the first time since the gambling had started. Papa, you were as much a victim as anyone else. Grimm manipulated you, used your weaknesses against you. I don't blame you for that. Patrick's eyes filled with tears. I'm going to get help, he promised. There's a group of men in the next county who meet to talk about their gambling problems. I'm going to start attending their meetings. I'm proud of you for that, Clara said, meaning it. And Papa? You're welcome to visit us on the mountain anytime. I think it would do you good to spend some time away from town. As they drove home up the mountain path, Clara reflected on everything that had changed. 6 weeks ago, she had been a desperate woman facing a forced marriage to a man who would have destroyed her. Now she was a beloved wife, a respected teacher, and a valued member of a community that had embraced her completely. "Silas," she said as their cabin came into view, "what do you think about Sheriff Morrison's offer?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think I've spent enough years hiding from the world," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to take a more active role in protecting people who can't protect themselves." Clara smiled, proud of the man she'd married. "I think you'd make an excellent deputy sheriff. But whatever you decide, I'll support you." "What about your teaching?" Silas asked. "If I take the job, we might need to spend more time in town." "The children need me wherever they are," Clara replied. "Mountain children, town children, they all deserve the chance to learn and grow. Besides," she added with a grin, "I rather like the idea of being married to a lawman." As they reached their cabin, Clara felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. The threats to their happiness had been defeated, the truth had been revealed, and their love had been tested and proven strong. They were ready for whatever the future might bring. 1 year later, Clara stood in the same church where her story had begun, but everything was different now. Instead of a desperate woman being forced into marriage, she was a radiant bride choosing to renew her vows with the man she loved. Instead of a hostile crowd watching her sacrifice, the sanctuary was filled with friends and family celebrating their happiness. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice warm with genuine joy, "we are gathered here today to witness the renewal of vows between Silas and Clara Boone, who wish to reaffirm their commitment to each other after a year of marriage based on love rather than necessity." Clara looked out at the congregation and marveled at how much had changed. Her father sat in the front pew, sober for 6 months now and looking healthier than he had in years. The Mountain families who had become her extended family filled several rows, their children, her students, grinning at her with excitement. Sheriff Morrison and his wife were there, along with Judge Hamilton and Attorney Warren, who had become good friends over the past year. Even some of the townspeople who had once shunned Silas were present, their faces reflecting genuine happiness for the couple who had overcome so much adversity. But it was Silas who commanded Clara's attention. He stood beside her in his best suit, looking handsome and confident in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with the peace he'd found. The shadows that had haunted his eyes for 8 years were gone, replaced by the quiet contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. The past year had been one of growth and healing for both of them. Silas had accepted the position of deputy sheriff and had quickly earned the respect of everyone in the county. His combination of strength, integrity, and genuine concern for justice made him exactly the kind of lawman the territory needed. Clara had expanded her teaching beyond the mountain school. 3 days a week, she taught the mountain children in their converted community hall. 2 days a week, she worked at the town school, helping children who had fallen behind in their studies. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling, and she had discovered a talent for reaching even the most difficult students. Their marriage had deepened and blossomed in ways Clara had never imagined possible. What had begun as a desperate bargain had become a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. They had learned to navigate the challenges of daily life together, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating each other's successes. The physical side of their marriage had developed naturally, without pressure or expectation. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire after a particularly good day, Clara had simply taken Silas's hand and led him to their bedroom. Not his bedroom or her bedroom, but theirs. The intimacy that followed had been tender and passionate, a true joining of two people who had chosen each other freely and completely. "Silas and Clara," the preacher continued, "you have already proven your commitment to each other through the trials you've faced and overcome. Today you stand before God and this community to speak new vows based not on desperation, but on the love you've built together." Silas turned to face Clara fully, taking both her hands in his. "Clara," he began, his voice steady and sure, "a year ago I married you to save you from a terrible fate. Today I renew my vows because you've saved me from a lonely one. You've brought light and laughter into my life, purpose to my days, and hope for our future together." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles as he continued. "I promise to love you not as the desperate woman I rescued, but as the strong, intelligent, beautiful woman you've always been. I promise to support your dreams, celebrate your achievements, and stand beside you through whatever challenges we may face." Clara felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she spoke her own vows. "Silas, you gave me freedom when I thought I had none, respect when I thought I didn't deserve it, and love when I thought it was impossible. You've shown me what it means to be truly valued, not for what I can provide, but for who I am. She squeezed his hands, feeling the calluses that spoke of his honest work and gentle strength. I promise to love you not as my rescuer but as my partner. I promise to support your calling to protect others, to build a home filled with love and laughter, and to face our future together with courage and hope. Do you have rings? The preacher asked. This was new. They had married so hastily the first time that there had been no time for rings. But Silas had spent weeks crafting matching bands from gold he'd panned from the mountain streams, each one engraved with a simple design of intertwined pine branches. As they exchanged rings, Clara marveled at how different this ceremony felt from their first wedding. There was no fear, no desperation, no sense of sacrifice. Only joy and love and the certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. By the power vested in me, the preacher proclaimed, and in the presence of these witnesses, I pronounce that Silas and Clara Boone have renewed their marriage vows and reaffirmed their commitment to each other. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. This time, when Silas kissed her, it was the kiss of a man claiming his beloved wife, not a stranger making a desperate bargain. Clara kissed him back with all the love and passion that had grown between them, to the cheers and applause of everyone present. The reception that followed was held in the church hall, with food provided by the Mountain families and decorations made by Clara's students. It was simple but heartfelt, a true community celebration of love triumphing over adversity. As Clara danced with her husband, really danced with him for the first time, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago she had been a woman with no choices, no hope, no future worth anticipating. Now she was a wife, a teacher, a valued member of her community, and a woman who looked forward to each new day. What are you thinking about? Silas asked as they swayed to the music provided by old Pete's fiddle and his grandson's guitar. I'm thinking about how different everything is from a year ago, Clara replied. How much we've both changed, how much we've grown. Do you ever regret it? Silas asked quietly. Marrying a stranger, giving up the life you might have had? Clara looked up into his blue eyes, seeing the same love and devotion she felt reflected back at her. Never, she said firmly. This is the life I was meant to have, Silas. You are the man I was meant to love. Everything that happened before was just preparing us for this. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Clara's father approached them with something in his hands, a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion, this was your mother's. Her wedding ring and a few other things she treasured. She always said it should go to you when you found true love. Clara opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was her mother's simple gold wedding band, a pair of pearl earrings, and a small locket containing a picture of her parents on their wedding day. She would have loved Silas, Patrick continued. She always said you'd need a man who was strong enough to match your spirit but gentle enough to cherish it. Thank you, Papa, Clara whispered, hugging her father tightly. This means more to me than you know. As they drove home up the mountain path under a sky full of stars, Clara wore her mother's ring on her right hand, next to the new band Silas had made for her. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. The past and the present, loss and love, sorrow and joy, all woven together into the tapestry of her life. Mrs. Boone, Silas said as they reached their cabin, what do you say we start working on the next chapter of our story? Clara laughed, delighted by the suggestion. They had talked about children, about expanding their family, about the legacy they wanted to build together on this mountain. I say that sounds like the perfect way to begin our second year of marriage, she replied. As Silas carried her over the threshold, something they hadn't done the first time, Clara felt a deep sense of completion. She had found her home, her purpose, her perfect partner. The desperate woman who had stood at that altar a year ago had been transformed into someone she barely recognized, someone confident, beloved, and free. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities and promise. There would be challenges certainly, but they would face them together. There would be joys to celebrate, children to raise, a community to serve, and a love to nurture for all the years of their lives. Clara Boone had everything she'd ever dreamed of and more than she'd dared to hope for. And it had all begun with a desperate man walking into a church and declaring, I haven't seen a woman in 8 years. Sometimes, Clara reflected as Silas kissed her in the doorway of their home, the most beautiful love stories begin with the most desperate circumstances. Sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when all hope seems lost, fate steps in and changes everything with a single moment of courage. Their story was just beginning. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining Clara and Silas on their incredible journey from desperation to deep, abiding love. Their story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments can lead us to our greatest blessings, and that true love is worth fighting for. I'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in Clara and Silas's story? Did you guess that Theodore Grimm was part of a larger criminal conspiracy? And what do you think the future holds for our mountain couple? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps me craft stories that truly resonate with readers like you.